Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Altmed podcast. With me as always, Mitch Kurtz in the house.
Hello.
And also joining us, someone we've been looking forward to chatting to on the podcast for a little while now. It is none other than Craig Cochrane, the CEO of Medcan. Craig, great to have you.
Yeah, great to be here, and sorry for keeping you waiting so long before I actually got on. My bad.
I think you were one of the really early ones we reached out to. Yeah, keen boys, keen, and that would have been around episode, I don't know, 6 or something like that.
As you mentioned before, Mitch, we've built a bit of traffic since then, so hopefully we're going to get more ears and eyes on this one than would have been
strategic. I said, I reckon it was strategic.
Yeah, that was my plan the whole time, guys.
Yeah, nice, Craig. It is kind of custom for us to explore your journey, but I also would love to hear about really the journey of Medcan as well, because it's a great story. So yeah, please take us through it.
Yeah, no worries at all. So Medcan was really created by myself and the other co-founder, Gareth Ball. Both of us, we'd been researching the space and interested in the space for a long period of time. My brother actually lives in Vancouver in Canada. Mm-hmm. And we obviously had a lot of interaction with what was happening in the Canadian cannabis space 10, 15 years ago. Gareth, through a lot of friends in Colorado, had sort of seen the same sort of shifts in legislation and social acceptance of medicinal cannabis. So as soon as we found out in 2016 legislation was changing, we looked to get licensed in the space. So we were one of the first companies to actually get an application into the Office of Drug Control. I think it was about a 5-page application that I wrote. Then with a bit of backwards and forwards for the next 12 or so months, we managed to get the 13th license for cultivation from the Office of Drug Control. So from there, I mean, Medcan was really, we always had the vision to be fully vertically integrated. Obviously, coming from our funding wasn't massive to start with. The one thing that we could do to get credibility in the industry was to get licensed across the supply chain. So manufacturer license, import, export, Queensland Health, wholesaling license, and just get what we could to position ourselves in the industry. Through 2017, it was about really securing licenses. And then from 18, 19, it was about actually trying to see how we fit in the Australian space. We've always been established to look to get cost-effective medications to patients. Initially, we didn't know how we were going to do that. The regulatory hurdles were huge initially, but we battled our way through, and obviously, bring us through to where we are today.
It is an amazing story, because I do think about the legacy that's been left behind by all of those early pioneers to the space. I mean, for listeners who aren't in the space, I mean, it's really difficult to explain the extent to which there was so much blood, sweat, and tears that went into getting licenses, from everything that I've been told by some of those early people to the space. I mean, for one, the regulators themselves were still playing catch up with understanding what their role was in sort of administering this new framework. So yeah, I can only imagine that there were a lot of hard conversations with different regulatory agencies, and it's a real credit that you toiled through, got everything under your belt, and as bootstrapped as you were, it looks as though Medcan's in a pretty strong position as a result of all that hard work.
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, Gareth and I really are, two guys from the burbs that decided to create Medcan. Obviously, we came to it with previous business experience, but always private enterprise. So for us, I think the early days, the capital markets were one that we got a harsh reality and harsh education about early on in the piece. But as we've sort of come through, we set our business fundamentals strong. We were always about the foundations of a business: short-term revenue strategy, brand awareness, market penetration. And we really stuck to our guns early on in the piece, when a lot of others were, trying to sell the sizzle of a pie in the sky dream. We really just sort of, knuckled down and did what we could with what we had, the resources that we had to get the business up and operational.
Are you insinuating that there was a bit of hype in the industry at one point?
There was oceans of money floating around in the space once, but we Yeah, and I've had this conversation with a lot of people before. We had a lot of false starts when it came to funding in the space. From the capital markets perspective, we had I'd say five really significant false starts where we were in term sheets, and for whatever reason, things fell over. We were almost acquired a number of times. We sort of got to the point where we thought we had it done in 2019, and that was about 2 months before the Canadian capital market crash in the cannabis space. So into 2019, where all the money disappeared, that was when we were like, we're about to get our funding, and then it fell over again. So, we've sort of experienced I'm going to say highs and lows, but there were a lot of lows when it came to the capital market side of things. There was a lot of sharks in the space. So we got quite the baptism in that space quite quickly. But again, we sort of persevered with what we were doing, and managed to get funding in the end to get us through to where we are now.
Yep, it's unbelievable. And like, I'm just so curious how you did that in such a market of turmoil and like so many volatile components, indicating what you couldn't do in terms of funding.
Yeah. And adding to that, what was then a relatively modest number of Australian patients that had been approved. So in terms of making the business case stack, I imagine, But as we sort of alluded to before, there was a lot of hype. There's companies that I remember were flying, back then, and they've just sort of disappeared from radar. What can you what can you recall from that turbulent time?
Honestly, what I can recall is a lot of people raising a lot of money and us wondering why we couldn't. I had this conversation literally this morning. It's one of those situations where a lot of guys went out there and sold the sizzle, raised a lot of funds, realistically didn't do a lot with those funds, watched market caps just erode to, from what they were, down. So for us, it was sort of looking at the industry and going, wow, if these companies that obviously are selling a dream that we don't think is credible can raise funds, but we can't, what's wrong with this space? But, we stuck to our guns. We raised a little bit of money in late 2019, which allowed us to do a few things. It allowed us to start executing on our business model. From there, we have some high net worth investors. They came through, dipped a toe in the water, saw that we actually executed on what we said we were going to do, and then came back in with significant funding. So, I think we haven't veered from what our initial scope of business was. We said we were going to do exactly this back in 2016. We've stuck to our guns. It's taken way longer than we hoped, but that's market conditions, legislation, like you say, minimal number of patients early on in the piece. But we sort of stuck to our guns and got there in the end.
Do you think that affects the credibility of the industry? Because these kinds of conversations, when we're having them, we gravitate to more sustainable, kind of scalable, or sustainable growth, let's say, by scaling incrementally. Maybe that's because we don't have the ability to capital raise like some of the big guys. But when you see Australian, shareholder or market caps get reduced to, massively, as they did kind of in Canada, do you think that changes the way that people perceive the market of cannabis in Australia as well?
100%. The industry has been discredited, especially from a capital market perspective. The early players raised a lot of funds, didn't execute. And literally, we look at our quarterly reports now with our ASX peers, because it's obviously quite easy to do. And we're in front of most of them. We have a bottom line, we're making money, we're paying shareholder dividends. So, if you do things right in the space, the rewards are there. The problem is a lot of these companies set out, raised a lot of money, not really knowing what they were going to do, then jumped from, you've just got to go back through ASX announcements, jump from one business model to another, to one location, to another location, to they're doing this, they didn't really know what they were doing. To a point where hundreds of millions of dollars of shareholder funds basically have been wiped. And it does discredit the industry. If companies going to raise capital now, you have a peer comparison. Anyone that's going to look to invest money in you will look at the peers, especially the ASX peers, because it's the easiest sort of source of information, and go, well, these guys raised all this money and couldn't execute on that. So why are you going to be any different? Definitely discredit the industry. But I'll also add to that there are some credible companies in the space. And, obviously we consider ourselves one of them, but there are a lot of other private companies, or a number of other private companies that are doing really well. You know, they're making good revenue. They're making, you know, maybe not net profit, but they're close to breaking even, but they're doing a lot of things right. So, you know, I think there are credible companies, but there's a larger proportion that, you know, just aren't generating revenue, and their break even points are miles in the future. And like I say to people is, the Australian space, if we look to one of our, you know, westernized neighbors being Canada, look at what the Canadian space did. Look at what the Canadian guys did. Look at their business models. Look at what didn't work, and don't do that. It's pretty straightforward. It's if it didn't work in Canada, chances are it won't work here. You know, very similar medical space before they went to adult use. You know, similar type of people, similar type of consumer. If it didn't work there, chances are it won't work here. So, you know, creating the next white elephant in Australia would just discredit the space even more.
So that makes me, sorry, I have to ask, Andrew, what is the secret sauce then, Craig? If you got it, what's the point of difference? What makes Medcan?
Well, I mean, it's not just what Medcan. There's a couple of questions there. The first one's, what's our point of difference? You know, we established ourselves across the entire supply chain. So we can leverage value at multiple points throughout the supply chain, right through from cultivation, right through to the end patient. So being a infant industry, that's what we initially did. We set up to be licensed across the entire supply chain, and not knowing where the value proposition was going to be along that supply chain, but knowing that, you know, nobody knew wholesale was going to be such a big thing back in the day. All of a sudden, wholesale is, you know, that's 25 to 30% of the margin for most companies' products is going to this wholesale and distributor. That wasn't something that we knew on the outset, but we thought, okay, let's be positioned to be able to leverage off that. So there's no real secret sauce. It was just about being prepared and being nimble enough to shift with the market. But knowing basic business fundamentals has probably been the biggest thing for us. Like I said, short-term revenue strategy, brand awareness, market penetration, you know, make sure your revenue is greater than your cost of goods. Simple things like that. And I say that with a smirk because
it's a strange concept.
I say that with a smirk because you know, the Canadian companies obviously released their end of year financials just recently, and you know, they have negative gross profits. Number of those companies, negative gross profit basically means that your cost of goods is greater than your revenue. And in any other industry in the world, I have never seen that. So it's you know, it is about creating a credible business that can actually sustain itself. Because at the end of the day, when all's said and done, you can have the best intentions for helping people, but if you can't maintain a business that's credible and sustainable, you can't help anybody.
Yeah, agree with that. I mean, you know, one of the crazy stories that I think, you know, even people who don't really take much of an interest in cannabis might have heard about is just that huge behemoth company in Canada, Aurora. I think their stock price fell nearly 50% at the end of May, you know, and you know, people are looking at that and just going, how is it so volatile over there? And, you know, why haven't we learned lessons here in Australia? I mean, do you feel that some of the, you know, because I think some of the other criticisms of that particular company were just, you know, huge remuneration packages being paid to the executives. I mean, do you think we've seen the worst of, you know, market fluctuation in the medical cannabis space as the industry was sort of coming to a footing, or do you believe that you know, some of the more volatile movements in the market might yet to be seen?
I think we've seen a lot of the damage done, but I think as far as the market cap's sort of disintegrating, I think that, you know, that's happened on a scale that I'm not sure that we'll see again. But what you will start to see is companies fall over now. You'll start to see guys that literally their balance sheet isn't strong enough. They don't have enough cash at bank to be able to cover their burn rate. I mean, there are a number of Canadian companies, which I won't name, but you know, they've only got 2 to 3 months, maybe a quarter left of cash. So that just means they go into a capital raise, they dilute current shareholders, and it's just that vicious sort of cycle to the bottom. You know, there's a lot of consolidation, a lot of M&A happening at the moment. Again, I had this conversation this morning with somebody else. It's M&A is great if you're acquiring assets that can sustain themselves. M&A is not so great when you're acquiring effectively companies that are massive loss leaders. Like you can only do that for so long before you run out of cash. So I think it's not going to be about market caps falling anymore. It's going to be companies actually falling over. It's going to be companies folding. As soon as big companies like that start liquidating their largest assets, there's issues. And then the next thing is cost cutting. Anyone that flies the flag of cost cutting in an industry that's effectively still riding a J curve upward is doing something wrong, because you shouldn't be focusing on cost cutting. You should be focusing on sustainable growth, not trying to rip your expenses out so your bottom line looks better.
What then for the I suppose, in addition to cap raises and sort of equity capital markets, what do you I think we've seen a lot of announcements to the market around debt financing as well, companies taking huge facilities and lines of credit, to I guess attempt to not dilute existing shareholders. Do you have any views on the success of those efforts, or any?
Well, it depends on the business model. I mean, if you're running a solid gross profit and your expenses are fairly contained, and you actually have a bottom line to be able to repay the interest on the debt that you've incurred, sure. But the problem is that the debt packages you're seeing at the moment that are getting flagged or getting highlighted, oh, we've got this new debt package. It's basically trying to borrow money to save a sinking ship. That's what they're trying to do. Because unless you can somehow generate that bottom line to be able to repay, firstly, the interest, and secondly, the principal, I mean, again, it's going to discredit the industry even more, because then you start having people default, and that's the next slippery slope. So, it goes back to sort of the top line and the gross profits, and companies focusing on a sustainable business and watching their expenses.
And the sort of the, aside from shareholders taking the hit, whether that's mum and dad retail investors or or large institutionals, sort of, I think, more forgotten about than those people affected by these sort of distressed companies are the actual employees. I've read numerous reports about layoffs that have occurred in Canada, and we might yet see that for companies that just aren't sustainable in Australia in terms of their growth strategy. I actually think I saw the other day that Compass Clinics is packing up. I know they're not necessarily a huge player, but this kind of worrying trend that a lot of people who are now currently employed might not be employed in say 6 to 12 months from now.
Yeah, I think it's one of those that there are, like I say, I go back to there are credible companies. So it's about trying to find, if you're looking for employment, looking for a credible company that's going to be there long term. And that's not always the ones that are yelling the loudest. It's a lot of the ones that are actually kicking the biggest goals, or the most goals, are the ones in the background that are actually achieving things quietly. I think it's, to spin this topic on its head a little bit, I think for us, it's always been about being able to give something back. So, corporate responsibility and giving something back is extremely important for us. And you can only do that if you get the actual credibility of the business right to start with, because you're talking about employees, but, spin that round to patients. If all of a sudden a company falls over, there's a bunch of patients there that are relying on that product all of a sudden, now becomes discontinued or no longer available. As far as price of product goes, yes, you can fight the race to the bottom by continually getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper product. But then what happens when that company falls over? The price of product shoot back up again. So it really goes back to just that, the business being credible, so that it can enable to help the people, which we're actually here to do. And, one of the big things that, we really fly a flag of is our compassionate access program. So we actually have a compassionate access program, which sees significant subsidies for patients that are in financial hardship, or have a chronic condition. Now, the only reason we can do that is because we've built our business around sustainable business practices. So we actually have a bottom line. We're able to substitute and subsidize medications, and we're actually able to give these things back to people. So, it's the industry itself needs a shake-up so that there's more credibility, and these businesses are around for longer, so they can start to get, some corporate responsibility, start getting some social responsibility, start to give back to people, as opposed to just raising shareholder funds and not doing anything.
I love that, because it's kind of, you hear complaints in the industry about, people can use maybe access to the extent that they have it, private health insurance policies to cover non-PBS medicines, and they might get something back for their cannabis medication under that. but there's no PBS because the products won't be accepted by the government, easily, and listed or registered on the ARTJ. It's like, well, you guys are proof that there's a market-based solution, which is that the companies themselves build into, to their bottom line, a means to be able to, provide compassionate access to those who are eligible to receive it.
Yeah, definitely. It goes back to ultimately helping people. And that's why we got into the space. Yes, new exciting industry, but we've always said that we've been patient focused. And, a lot of other companies do say that, but what have they actually done to show that? What are they actually doing to give something back? That's a big thing for us, is that being able to give that back and be able to see people that otherwise would benefit from this medication, yet simply can't afford it, then getting access. And you can only do that once you get the business itself stable and have the fundamentals in place to be able to start to give something back, and still have a bottom line and all the other things that
for particularly aggrieved shareholders that have sunk a lot of money into these companies, they should have a compassionate dividend program to try and help those people out. The ones that they've really burned. But
you can try and sell that story to some of the ATX guys if you like.
Oh dear.
I note that this conversation's gone very, very business centric, and I think there's some other juicier parts that we can also add to the conversation, because I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about Medcan and the interesting side of the actual grow rather than just shareholders. And like, when did you do your first cultivation? Like, how did you choose the strains? What kind of stuff have you come up against? The seasons, the elements in up in the north there, and some of the more kind of, at least for me, interesting parts of the journey.
Yeah, definitely. The business part, like, it's probably the least interesting, but in my opinion, the most important.
Sure.
Talking about some fun stuff, let's talk about cultivation.
Please.
Cultivation for us was, again, and I looked at Canada again. So we looked at Canada and went, okay, what is the best products we can find in Canada? And we did this through 2014, 15, 16, 17. Went, okay, what's the best product we can find? Okay, how's it growing? Where's it growing? What have they done that makes it so special? And Medcan's strategy has been to basically replicate that. We're not reinventing the wheel. We simply found what we thought was the best that we could find, worked out how it was growing, and then copying exactly the same thing. So over here, it's indoor cultivation. So vertical farming, LED lighting, basically controlled environment clean rooms. So GACP, GMP quality, that's what we're aiming for. So everything's growing indoors. All of the plants basically get any inputs they get are provided by us. What it allows us to do is have a controlled environment, reproducible conditions, reproducible products. So the product that we grow today in 2 years' time should be identical, because it's basically growing the same strain, grown the same condition with the same inputs. And quite frankly, that compared to growing outdoor or broadacre or greenhouses, it's hard to compare the two. So especially being in Southeast Queensland, we've basically been in a flood and tropical storm for the last 9 months. So there's no way that you could be growing broadacre in Queensland or Southeast Queensland recently and not have lost crops.
You can do indoor grows for lettuce now and probably make more money, I think, is the situation.
Yeah, so that's $10 an iceberg. That's awesome. I saw one on eBay actually that was at $75. I thought that was a bit cheeky, but
that's amazing. I love that.
Yeah, but I mean, it's one of those things where, from a risk mitigation perspective, it's we think it's the safest way to cultivate. It's also seen that the best product that we've seen anywhere in the world has come out of a cultivation process very similar to what we're doing.
Okay. And then in terms of, there's probably a bit of IP around this, but I'm always keen on the genetic play. That's a little bit of my background. I'm just curious to know kind of where you're leaning. Like, if you can't tell us strains, then, do you see certain regions, certain types, certain sativa, indica blends? Where's your head at when it comes to that side of things?
Mitch.
I'm cheeky. No,
I think I've got no issues talking strains, because people's opinions of IP around strains differs. Ours is pretty open. When you're talking about dried flower, which basically, if you're talking about strains specifically, you're talking about a dry flower market. You need to look at, I guess, what the consumer, being the patient, is actually after. What are the products they're looking for? What's available in the space at the moment? The big metric they use in Canada at the moment, it's got to be plus 20% THC. And anyone who knows anything about cannabis knows that, that's a great flag to fly, but it doesn't really mean much. What are the minor cannabinoids? What's the terpene profiles? So when we're looking for our cultivation programs and when we're doing pheno hunts, we're looking for a number of things. So from a commercial perspective, it goes back to biomass, biomass and time for flowering. How quickly does it flower and how much biomass is produced? And also then what's the THC content? But for us, it's about getting a spread. It's about looking at, some indica dominance, some sativa dominance, looking at the various hybrids and selecting products that we feel, patients will look to, will like, looking at, okay, well, how's this strain, or the lineage, what has that been used for previously? What sort of consumer, what sort of indications from a medical perspective has that been used for? So it's not really about reinventing the wheel. It's about finding things that work, that are commercially viable, that we think consumers will like, and then providing a range. I mean, if we had a downfall as a business from the get-go, was we were a one-trick pony with one of our products. So our first dried flower product we released, we only had one. That's all we had. The constant feedback was, you need more variety. Okay, that's fair enough. Point taken. Let's get some more variety. Let's look at some different strains. Let's look at some other things. So it's not about specific, let's grow an AK-47 or let's grow a Mockham's Tulip or let's do this. It's about, okay, let's look at the spread of products that we have and getting samplings that are, sativa dominant. For us, it's about, the terpene profiles and minor cannabinoids are massive for us as well. So it's not just about the THC. It's about, okay, what is the full terpene profile of that strain? Is it new? Is it, a standard White Widow #1 type product? And how would that fit into the Australian space? Would it be accepted? I mean, quite personally, White Widow #1, the original White Widow strain, I love it. I think it's one of the best terpene profiles ever. It's about 14%. Consumer may or may not like that. So for us, it's about really going through and looking at the strains and not just picking a strain name, because one of the things that we have found throughout our pheno hunts is you can plant 10 seeds of the same genetic from the most credible seed supplier there is, and all of those seeds will be different. So it's really about selecting that specific pheno within a strain and then looking at its properties and obviously continuing that as a mother plant, which we can use for cultivation in the future.
Huge bump up there for one of our previous guests, Shanti Baba, aka Scott Blakey, who cultivated and sort of invented that first White Widow strain. So I hope he's listening and hears that feedback.
In terms of how many strains you would have on the go, like how does a pheno hunt look in Australia at the moment? Obviously, you'd be limited by space, I imagine, if you're doing it indoors, for example, or there'd be other certain things to consider or considerations, let's say, in doing that. Like, would you be able to just take, I mean, how many seeds would you take to do a pheno hunt from? How many different strains would you then take? So is it like 200 seeds? Is it 10 seeds? Like what, I'm just curious on the process.
Yeah, well, see, for us, it's not so much about the restrictions around so much space. It's around the processing and what you're going to do with it. Because if you think of the actual fundamentals and the process you have to go through, so say you plant 10 seeds, you've got to run all those 10 seeds right up to effectively a mother plant. Then you've got to take some cuttings, then you've got to run them through a number of flower cycles. So you take 10 plants, and then you're going to take, say, 3 to 4 cuttings off each of those plants. So now you've got 30 to 40 cuttings, and then you've got to run through a flowering cycle. At the same time, you've got to keep maintaining those mothers. So whether you're taking more cuttings and creating more mums to maintain that, the mums, or whether you just let him go into a larger mum, what have you. Then from there, you've got to get all them through a flower process, got to get all through a drying, curing process, and only then can you test them. Then you test them. But at the same time, you have to be maintaining that in the background. So because of obviously the life cycle of the cannabis plant, it doesn't make any sense to try and do hundreds and hundreds of seeds at once, because it's too much process. You end up with way too many physical plants and way too much biomass. So it is about, that maybe 10 seeds of a certain strain, run them through the cycle. And then you have to, obviously, you've got to validate it a few times. So you need to run a few cycles to be able to go, okay, wow, this just wasn't a fluke. We just pulled a really excellent, harvest and yield and THC for cannabinoid profile on one shot. You've got to do that a few times. So pheno hunting isn't a chuck a lot of seeds in the field, let them all grow, and then harvest them, and because it just doesn't work like that. There's a lot of science behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's very interesting. I mean, what do you think people are looking for at the moment? I mean, obviously a range, as you said, people want different things for different ailments, different times of day, different all sorts of reasons. But if you had to say, based on, without naming specific products, but based on your experience, where are people's preferences kind of gathering?
It's a hard one, because a lot of what we found is a lot of patients will use numerous products. So they'll use a heavy hitting indica for nighttime use or chronic pain, but they still want to function during the day. So they'll choose a sativa as well. So when we're looking through and seeing, okay, what are patients ordering? A patient might order 2 tubs of a strong indica that they're going to use for sleep or pain. They might order potentially 2 to 4 tubs of a sativa that they're going to use for daytime use, so they can get up and still be active. So really, they'll have an indica for night, sativa for day, and then whatever in between. But we are finding that patients don't just stick to a single strain. They will have a range of 2, 3, 4 potential strains for use at different times throughout the day, because a lot of people still want to be able to function. They want to be able to medicate in the morning and still be able to go to work and still be a functioning human. Where if you've got a really heavy hitting indica, and that was what our first product to market was, a heavy hitting indica, you couldn't medicate in the morning and then go to work. It just wouldn't work. So we are finding that patients are getting more savvy about when they actually want to use a product and what they specifically want to use it for. Like some patients will simply just use a product to go to sleep. So it'll be a heavy indica and they'll just use that before bed, but they don't like using it otherwise, because it does make them couch bound. It does make them sleepy. And they don't necessarily like that effect during the day.
Yeah, fair enough. And what about the CBD flower side of things? Is that something in your sights or underway, or is that something
we're working on it at the moment? I mean, it's a small market. It's obviously a small part of the market. And what we'll find is a lot of the GPs prescribing our products will prescribe a CBD oil with dried flower anyway. So they get that CBD. CBD, I think, for me personally, if I had to explain how that sits into the medical environment, it's a maintenance dose. So CBD is something you take an oil during the day and oil in the morning, oil at night, and it's basically just a maintenance dose to continue. It's not for anything breakout. Whereas, talking about pediatric epilepsy, you feel you're going to have a breakout seizure, you need to medicate, you need to vaporize, you need to get it done now, boom. Whereas CBD, from my perspective, is far more of just something that happens in the background. So, do you need to vaporize a CBD flower on what positive effect is that going to give you? I just, it's harder for me to articulate that.
You're saying kind of, combine the CBD oil or maybe even a CBD vape, let's say, as a distillate vape, let's say, with a THC flower or something of that ilk.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm curious to know, do you have any thoughts on potentially strain specific oils or distillates or these or vapes or things like this in the future? Is that something that you think about much?
I think about that a lot.
Okay, that's good. That's it. Good. Next question.
Well, no, I mean it's obvious. If somebody likes a certain strain, are they going to like a certain vape oil with that strain? 100%. But it goes back to then the credibility of the process. So when they're doing, are they reintroducing the terpenes? What does that look like? How's it getting extracted? Are there residual solvents? Because it sort of takes you into another skew of, okay, well, what is that product and how is it manufactured? But if you're talking about a specific strain that you enjoy or that you like or that works for you, and then you can get a extracted oil with the terpenes reintroduced into a vape pen, perfect. That's excellent. That would be a great product, I would imagine.
Well, I mean, arguably one of the issues, I guess, debatably, would be shelf life, for example, of let's say botanical herb product. Even though we are seeing some pretty long shelf lives coming out, but versus say an oil, I would imagine the longevity of those two things would be a little bit different. Is that your opinion as well, or not really?
Yeah, definitely. But it also goes back to, with the flower side of things. And again, Australia's sort of in its infant stages at the moment. So patient numbers are still increasing. In a perfect world, you shouldn't need a massive shelf life on a dried flower product, because people want a fresh product. You don't want to have a product that's been sitting there for 18 months. Yeah, shelf life might say it's stable for 18 months. Yeah, great. But it's botanical. There is terpene degradation. Like, people don't want an older product. So, short answer is yes, oil will have a longer shelf life, definitely. But a flower consumer will want a fresher product more regularly. They won't want product that's been sitting there with an 18-month shelf life. As far as the vape oil, yes, obviously it'll last a lot longer. But again, have stability trials been performed on full extract oils in a concentrate form for 24 months? I know there's some going on, but again, people want fresher products. I think the shelf life thing is relevant when you have massive amounts of biomass that's getting stockpiled. But when you're actually, when you have a patient base that's consuming a product, I think fresher product is better every day.
Yeah, I mean, of course.
Just thinking about the actual thresholds where you have 10% each way on oils and 20%, I do query the stability data that comes out about some of the flowers, because you're really sort of grappling with this idea that if there's 20% to play with, I mean, if somebody's marketing a T20 flower, then over the course of 2 years, if that drops to T16 after stability, I mean, that's still sort of within scope. So it's an interesting one. I
think that is a huge issue that you've just flagged there, whether you meant to or not. Was false label claims. I mean, that's false label claims is a massive thing. We have been privy to test data from almost all of our competitors, and there's a lot of, let's say, porcupines being told at the moment when it comes to label claims. And eventually the TGA will catch up to a lot of this. I mean, we've had, I think, as only about a month ago now, all of our products, every product we have in the market has now been validation tested or a sample tested by the TGA. So, that's testament to the fact that we don't make false label claims. What we say is what's in the product, but we obviously know that there's others that are potentially not doing that. So that comes out in the wash.
Absolutely. I'm potentially, I've read murmurs that the technology in train where people might actually be able to fairly accurately test their own products at home, so they don't need to purchase a $10,000 chromatographic machine, or
like $100,000.
$100,000. Million. But basically, I think, I mean, that would be a bit of a game changer, obviously for people at home. But I do agree. I think there's, I think there are. I mean, there was a big story about it. I think it was back in 2020 that the top third best-selling products were tested, and that caused a bit of controversy. But yeah.
Speaking about the people at home, you kind of see this shift, not even a shift, but basically coming out in the wash that Australian patients really do want Australian products. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that movement. I mean, there's a lot of different imported products, and some of them are good, but there's this kind of thing happening now where we've got a lot of Australian companies looking overseas, looking at Germany, looking at the UK, looking at other markets, when it feels like we're not fully servicing the Australian market as it currently stands. Very, very keen to get your thoughts on that as a domestic cultivator.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've got to look after your backyard first. First and foremost, you've got to look after your own people first. You've got to look after Australian patients. Again, that's always been, that's, as a company, we've always flown that flag that's what we want to look to do. I think talking about that topic from a 16,000 foot perspective, I think the issue with the Australian space is, as opposed to the Canadian space, was that we allowed imports. You're looking at Canada, Canada, for example, they don't allow imports. So the only products that Canadian consumers have consumed are products that are basically being grown within Canada by their local producers. Because we allowed imports, what it actually did was, I mean, and companies like ourselves are, we were the ones that did it. We found the best product we possibly could out of Canada, and then we imported it. So what that did was all of a sudden give this set the bar high when it came to what a consumer expected, because now, when you've taken one of the best quality products you can find in Canada and bring it over to Australia, that's a pretty high bar that's been set now. So Australian patients sort of, yes, they are parochial and they prefer to get Australian product, but it's going to take a while before Australian product can get to the standard of some of these Canadian growers that have been growing for 10 or 15 years longer than what we have. They've refined their processes. They've got this product which has set this bar really high. So, for Australia consumer perspective, they've had, almost the best of the best. So now Australian companies really have to get to a level where the quality of product has to be really good to be competitive. Ultimately, yes, I do think that Australian patients do want Australian grown product 100%. And I do think that Australian companies should be focusing on Australian patients first and foremost. But it is hard when, price drops in the biomass that's sort of starting to stockpile in Canada, and they're doing file sale prices, and you can start to import products so much cheaper. This is actually something that we will actively lobby for, in the near future. That they're bringing in the GMP, so the GMP equivalent for an imported product. But it has to get to a point where, if you want the Australian industry to flourish, there has to be some sort of import tax, excise tax, some sort of tax on products that come in that are imported. Because ultimately, Canada is 10 to 15 years in front of us. They will be able to get product that's growing so cost effectively, that's still high quality, that's going to make it hard for Australian cultivators to actually compete.
Which then, just something that I remember spun off out of the recent amendments to the TGO 93 that introduced that quality standard that will apply from 1 July next year is, I'm fairly certain the TGA had to make submissions to the World Trade Organization, which has a sort of select committee that deals with, whether or not there's unfair competition between domestic and international supply. So yeah, that could raise a few headaches there. But you're absolutely right that you have countries where, the cost of labor is incredibly cheap. I'm not necessarily even thinking about Canada when I talk about this, but, if they have facilities which are, in that country, which are EU GMP or to whatever GMP standard that will comply with the Australian requirements, but they're able to produce it at a much lower cost, then, you have to sort of query whether or not the playing field has actually been leveled.
Yeah, and I honestly don't think that it has. And exactly what you've raised there. You go to, well, let's just pick one, Colombia, for example. Colombia, you get an EU GMP facility there, and then you can send your product all over the world. Now, you're right in what you said, that cost, that cost per gram is going to be a massive issue if they can get the quality standard right. But if they get the quality right, then you're exactly right. It becomes a massive issue, and then it becomes commoditized. Then it's simply the same product at a cheaper price from somewhere else. So being in this in the Australian industry ourselves, we do see that as a risk. But at the same time, it goes back to quality of products grown. It goes back to, Australian patients looking for Australian product.
Yeah. And there's I think there's a push towards kind of, at least for want of a better term, sort of economic protectionism, where people are looking inward rather than outward. This kind of free run that globalization had for a time there at least appears to have slowed down, and maybe the selling point from domestic LPs is Aussie jobs, Aussie manufacturing, those types of angles are sort of pitched to patients if they have a choice.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, once there's enough companies producing enough biomass to start to service a large portion of Australia, then there can be a legislative push to look to try and, okay, well, let's tighten this up more when it comes to an import side of things. But what I think you'll find, going back to your point about the GMP side of things that comes in middle of next year, I think it will see a lot of companies sort of falling by the wayside. There are companies that are bringing in product that isn't coming from GMP facilities, and that will, it's going to take time to see what that looks like. But I think that will wipe a lot of, a lot of companies with products in Australia out, because they're simply just importing the cheapest product they can find.
Yeah,
actually, that time is 1 year and 15 days. Actually, So
Not that anyone's counting, eh?
yeah, I've just got I'll turn off my clicker.
Yeah, no, I thought you were randomly staring into a crystal ball.
Yeah, I do that from time to time.
Yeah, so I mean that is a bit of time for companies to get some sort of GMP behind them, but at the same time, there are a lot of companies that'll never reach that. So it goes back to a quality product and getting it, because quality doesn't just come with a GMP certificate.
Yeah,
I mean, a product with a GMP certificate that's absolute rubbish.
Yeah. And I think like there's a lot of things that you can get. Two versions. You can get the cheap Chinese version, or you can get an Australian version, and you end up having markets for both. There's certain people that will always just go for the lowest cost, doesn't matter what. And then you've got people that maybe want that thing to last a little bit longer, or have a different experience, or ensure that they know what they're getting.
Your yellowtail versus, something a little bit.
Penfolds Grange.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it goes back to, our biggest competitor, and I say this, all the time, our biggest competitor is the black market. So, if people want a cheap product, there's a lot of cheap products that are out there on the black market that are easy to get. I don't think people are going to want their medical product to necessarily be just based on a price point. They're looking for value. They're looking for something that works, something that's clean, something that's consistent as well. So I think you will find that people that want really cheap will revert back to black market cheap.
I'm not so sure that the black market is that much cheaper, if at all, in some circumstances.
I don't think right now it is, but I think it's got a lot of move. It's got a lot of room to move.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
It's got a lot of room to move, and I think it'll get to that point where, if all of a sudden all of the patients shift from the black market to a legal supply, the black market will do things, and the only thing they can compete on is price point. So that will get that price point down. But at the end of the day, like you say, there will always be people who have a high quality product, and some people who will just want something that works, that's cost effective.
Well, price point and access, I think, is the other part that is a factor for people choosing. I know there's people that just can't be bothered going through a doctor.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But I guess, it depends what you want. Do you want something that you know what it is and it's been tested, or it's a high quality, or it's the actual amount of THC that it says, for example, as opposed to ye old bushweed.
Although we have covered off on potentially dubious label claims in the legal market. But
that's true.
Before I let you go, Craig, I know we're sort of approaching time, but I just had a last question for you. Are you still doing martial arts? And is it fair to say that if you are, that you're the only CEO of a medical cannabis company with a black belt?
I haven't quite got my black belt yet. I've been, but yes, and I'd say probably yes.
Green belt. I have to ask.
Which color belt are you at?
I'm almost at black belt. I'm very close to black belt, but
I think that's a sign to the market. Don't mess.
I've been training for years. It's like one of those things where I had heaps of time before Medcan to train jiu-jitsu, and then as soon as Medcan came along, my time for jiu-jitsu has dwindled substantially. So. I might be 50 years old having this conversation with you guys going, I'll get that one day. But
so basically you're a sitting duck these days because you're out of practice. And if someone wants to fight you in the street.
Well, I like to think I have some sort of retention of like 15 years of training. I'd like to think I know something, but you never know.
All right, well, I'm definitely sending Mitch in if he wants to test that theory. But, no, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, Craig. Really appreciate your insights, both on the sort of the business side, and also just on, what it's like day to day to run a fairly large company. And I know it wasn't always that way, but hearing the journey of how you guys got to where you are now, it's a really great story, very inspirational. And I'm sure our listeners will have really enjoyed taking on your insights.
Thanks for having me. It's been good. Really appreciate it. And sorry I left you guys hanging for so long. It's been something now.
Well, we got you now, so it's all good.
No. Thanks so much, Craig. Until next time, take care.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Cheers.